only source for rhetoric. You'd be thinking, why do we have a unit on rhetoric? Why do people study this? It's terrible. So fortunately, we're moving past Plato to Aristotle. Aristotle had a very different perspective on rhetoric, and he's really the reason why we still study rhetoric today, because Aristotle believed that rhetoric was useful, and in fact that it was hard to be without it. And so Aristotle sort of resuscitates rhetoric from where it had fallen after Plato's critiques. And Aristotle is the single most significant rhetorical theorist in history. In fact, much of what we still know about rhetoric today, much of the way that people use messages to communicate, comes from the very principles that Aristotle talked about more than 2,000 years ago. So let's talk about who he was, and then in this video we're going to focus on the concept Aristotle said was the reason he wrote his book on rhetoric. That's what we're going to do in this video. So who was Aristotle? First of all, interestingly, he was a student of Plato. So Plato hated rhetoric, taught Aristotle. Aristotle, and I don't know, maybe he thought, man, he's always been a little rough on rhetoric. I think it's not so bad. So maybe this was kind of a reaction to Plato's perspective on rhetoric. But nevertheless, he was taught by Plato, and he had a very famous student of his own, Alexander the Great. So in terms of chronology, we start with the sophists, like Gorgias, then we have Socrates, and then Plato, and then Aristotle, and then Alexander the Great. Now we're not studying all of those people, but I just want to give you a little bit of historical context about them. Now, Plato used dialogues. Aristotle, not so much. His book, that you've read a part of, is simply called On Rhetoric. And it's essentially a workbook, a manual for how to do rhetoric well. So I think Aristotle agreed with Plato that there were ways to abuse rhetoric. And so he wrote a manual on how to do it well. His definition of rhetoric, and this is similar to the one that we're using in this class, is the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. Now, I'm going to use a little bit broader definition. I'm going to call rhetoric the strategic use of symbols, which is a little bit broader. Aristotle's focused a little more on persuasion. I think we can use symbols strategically to do lots of things, to inform, to educate, to question. We don't necessarily have to be persuasive to use rhetoric. But Aristotle's perspective was a good rhetorician is able to see all the possible ways to persuade and then choose the best one. And so that's what this means. The faculty of observing, in any case, the available means of persuasion. Interestingly, he believed good rhetoric wasn't necessarily successful. And it could be that you've wondered about this. You felt like somebody had a better argument, maybe in politics, a better case for being elected, and they didn't get elected. So does that mean that person was a bad rhetorician? Aristotle would say no. It didn't necessarily mean that. There are lots of situations where someone might be very good at what she does or very good at what he does, and they're not successful every time. Think about when you go to the doctor. You go to the doctor checks you out, the doctor says, I don't know, half the time, oh, it's a virus. There's nothing I can do for you. You know, drink plenty of fluids, get some rest. These will help your body have a chance to recover. Do you think, well, that was useless. I'm never going to go to the doctor again. The doctor doesn't know what the doctor's talking about. No, you don't. You still respect the doctor for being able to figure that much out, right? And give you the advice that you could do. So even though the doctor didn't fix your problem, you don't completely dismiss the doctor. Aristotle says rhetoric is the same way. You might make the best case, and you know, people are fickle. It's a complicated world. People might not follow the best case every time. It doesn't mean you were a bad rhetorician if you were doing the things that he says make somebody a good rhetorician. So, this is kind of a weird thing because not many people, I think, would associate this with Aristotle. But in his own book, he says the main reason he writes is because not enough has been written about enthymeme. See that weird word right there, enthymeme? That's what he says is his main reason for writing on rhetoric. It's probably not the main thing that we've taken away from it, but it's his primary motivation for writing. So we're going to do a little assignment. I'm going to introduce this concept to you today because obviously Aristotle thought it was super important. Sometimes an enthymeme is called a rhetorical syllogism because it's really based on the idea from classical reasoning of the syllogism, of logical reasoning. So let's look at a couple of syllogisms and think about how they become enthymemes. Basically, an enthymeme is a syllogism where one term is missing. And here's an example from Aristotle. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, we've already talked about reasoning, and so this is true and valid. Yes, all men are mortal. In other words, this is pre-zombie apocalypse at least, so everybody dies. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Yes. If both those things are true, then Socrates is mortal. So this is sound. It's true. It's valid. It's a nice, tight little argument. Now, as an enthymeme, we drop out one of those terms that we expect the audience to be able to fill in. So we might say, Socrates is mortal, for all men are. But what does the audience need to fill in? That Socrates is a man. Now it seems so obvious you don't even think about it, right? Or we could do it this way. If Socrates is a man, he is mortal. Well, of course that makes sense because we know all men are mortal. The reason Aristotle thought enthymemes were so powerful, and I think he was right, is because they get the audience to take part in the argument. So I don't even think about it necessarily, but I make the link that makes his enthymeme make sense. I fill in the missing term about Socrates being a man or all men being mortal. And it seems so natural that it kind of gets me nodding along with the speaker or the writer and thinking, yeah, of course that's right, because I'm participating. Aristotle thought that was really popular. Let's look at an enthymeme that's a little bit closer to home perhaps. You might have encountered this stereotype that all Americans are rude. Now, I don't think that's true. If you're not from the United States originally, I don't know how you feel about that. But let's just take this stereotype that some people have. All Americans are rude. Jenny is an American. So for this to be sound, Jenny has to be rude, right? If all Americans are rude and Jenny is an American, then Jenny must be rude in this argument. Now, how would we make that an enthymeme? Of course Jenny is rude. She's an American. Now, we're expecting that our audience is going to fill in all Americans are rude. Now, if you say that to an American, that person might say, wait a minute, what do you mean? Of course Jenny's rude. Because they don't fill in that missing term. But with an audience that believes all Americans are rude, you don't need to explain this any further. Check out this cartoon and see if you can make sense of it. Before paper and scissors. What do you need to be able to know to make sense of this cartoon? You need to know there's a game called rock, paper, scissors. If all you've got is rock, it's a pretty lousy game. This cartoon is an example of something that works enthymematically. In other words, it operates like an enthymeme because the audience has to fill something in order to make sense of it. So it's not exactly the same as a logical enthymeme like the syllogisms that we looked at, but in this assignment that I'm going to give you, I want you to find a cartoon that works enthymematically to show that you understand the way an enthymeme works. That the creator provides something, and then the audience has to provide something to make it all work. And that in so doing, the audience participates, and then, as Aristotle would say, it's a more effective argument that way. So let's look at some other examples of cartoons. Obviously, if I'm using them here, you can't use them for the assignment. But I want to make sure you understand exactly what I'm looking for. So here's an example. Here's another one. Now, to make sense of this, you really need to know two things. You need to know that there's a restaurant called IHOP, that's International House of Pancakes. And you also need to know that this guy is pushing an instrument called a xylophone that starts with an X. You need to know both of those things for this cartoon to make sense. Here's another one. What do you need to know to make sense of this cartoon? You need to know the expression, the idiom, like a bull in a china shop. If somebody's really clumsy or causing a lot of destruction, they're like a bull in a china shop. So we've got a bull, a china shop, don't even think about it. That's what makes it make sense. If you don't know that idiom, then this enthymeme essentially doesn't work because you don't understand it. Here's an old Far Side cartoon. Look here, McGinnis. Hundreds of bright copper kettles, warm woolen mittens, brown paper packages tied up with string. Someone was after a few of this guy's favorite things. Sure enough. What makes this funny? Well, if you know there's a song from The Sound of Music that has these very words that's called My Favorite Things, well then you get the joke. But you've got to provide that for it to make sense. And then I like this one. Sliced bread. Mary, you're a genius. Why, this is the greatest thing since heck, I don't know. Now the joke here, of course, is there's another idiom that's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And if you know that idiom, then you understand the joke in him not being able to come up with an analogy. But that makes it work like an enthymeme. You have to provide something for it to make sense. So, for this assignment, you need to find a cartoon that is enthymematic. Now, I would recommend that you find a single panel cartoon. I think those tend to be enthymematic. Not every cartoon requires you to fill in information. So don't think any cartoon you find is going to work. You're going to have to find one where clearly there's something missing that the audience, that the reader has to provide for it to make sense. You can't use cartoons from the Exponent, but you can use cartoons from the website that I've given you here, which has a lot of different syndicated cartoons. You can look back and choose from them. You're also welcome to use one of your own favorites. If you've got an old Calvin and Hobbes book or Herman or The Far Side or something like that, you might be able to find an enthymematic cartoon, and you can take a picture of it or scan it or whatever as part of this assignment. Your goal here is to turn it in with a one-sentence explanation of why it is an enthymeme or how it works enthymematically. So the same way I did with the bright copper kettles, warm woolen mittens example, you'd have to say, the reader needs to know there's a song from The Sound of Music that has these same lyrics. That's it. That's all you need. The cartoon and then what the reader has to provide to make it make sense. Now there are a couple that I've seen a lot of and I don't want to see them anymore. Lockhorns are off limits. There's also a cartoon that a lot of students have used in the past that involves Jewish stereotypes. Can't use those. Those are off limits. But follow the directions on Blackboard for turning that in. And I hope you'll leave with a greater understanding of the enthymeme, which is Aristotle's primary reason for writing on rhetoric.